So, imagine you're on an 1820s wooden ship, right? And you are tasked with sailing completely off the edge of the known map, just into this absolute void of shifting sandbanks, totally uncharted, hostile reefs everywhere.
Yeah, a literal blank space on the charts.
Exactly. And picture this vessel surviving this catastrophic, hull-shattering destruction and then going on to serve as the literal and economic foundation for an entire colony on the remote coast of Australia.
It's incredible.
It is. And this is the crazy part. After all of that genuine heroism, having its proud legacy systematically hijacked by a literal carnival sideshow fraud.
A century-long hoax.
Right. So, welcome to today's Deep Dive. We are exploring the incredible true story of HMS Success, which was launched in 1825. It's a Royal Navy warship whose voyages laid the groundwork for the Swan River colony, which you probably know today as modern-day Perth, Western Australia.
And the historical footprint of this specific vessel is, well, it's phenomenally complex. To trace it accurately for you today, we're pulling from a really varied stack of sources that we've got on the table here.
Yeah, a massive stack.
We're looking at official historical naval records straight from the Admiralty. We have these really extensive passages from the personal diary of the ship's clerk, plus broad Wikipedia archives covering 19th century naval architecture.
And the archaeology stuff, too.
Right. Detailed maritime archaeology reports published by the Western Australian Museum. And to top it off, this fascinating, this really wild collection of sensationalized, heavily fabricated newspaper clippings from the late 1800s and early 1900s.
So the mission for this deep dive, what we're really trying to do for you today, is untangle the genuine engineering and exploratory triumphs of the 1825 HMS Success from the bizarre hoax of a completely different ship that basically stole its identity.
It's a wild ride.
It really is. So to do that properly, we have to start with the birth of the ship itself. Looking at the Admiralty orders from June 1819, we are talking about an Atholl-class corvette, though she wasn't actually launched from the Pembroke Dockyard in Wales until August 1825.
Yeah, and that delay, that 6-year gap between the order and the launch, it really speaks to the shifting priorities of the post-Napoleonic Royal Navy. They were figuring out what they needed. But when she did finally hit the water, she represented a very specific type of utility.
Right. She wasn't some massive ship of the line.
No, not at all.
Right.
The construction costs are recorded at just over 14,300 pounds. She measured 114 feet overall, with a gun deck of about 113 feet 8 inches. She had a beam of 31.5 feet, and she displaced nearly 500 tons.
Which sounds big until you compare it to the really heavy hitters of the era.
It's exactly. Officially, the Navy list categorized her as a 6th-rate ship. But, and this is where it gets interesting, the colloquial term used by the sailors of the time for this class of vessel was a donkey frigate.
A donkey frigate. I mean, that term alone carries such a specific vibe. It's not a racehorse. It's a donkey. Just stubborn, unglamorous labor.
It's the perfect metaphor.
It perfectly encapsulates the economic reality of the British Empire at that exact moment. I mean, the Admiralty just couldn't afford to send those massive multi-deck ships of the line or even the large 5th-rate frigates to go out and conduct routine surveys or project soft power way down in the southern hemisphere.
The operating costs alone would have been astronomical.
Right. The required manpower, the sheer amount of food and water, the victualling requirements, it would have completely bankrupted the colonial exploration budget.
Precisely. You have to remember, the empire was rapidly expanding its geographic footprint, particularly out in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. And they desperately needed a vessel that could perform the heavy lifting, the long-haul work of a traditional frigate, but at a fraction of the logistical footprint.
They needed a minivan, not a sports car.
Basically, yeah. These donkey frigates became the dependable beasts of burden. They were robust enough to survive the brutal open ocean, but economical enough to be dispatched on these multi-year deployments out to the absolute fringes of the known world, places where resupply was an absolute logistical nightmare.
And when you look at the structural design of the Success, it really reflects that mandate for isolation and endurance. The architectural schematics we have show this transitional approach, spearheaded by a team of prominent surveyors of the Navy, Henry Peake, Joseph Turner, and Robert Seppings.
Brilliant naval architects.
Totally. Because if we look at traditional 18th century naval design, you usually see these rounded, sweeping hulls, really graceful. But the Atholl class explicitly featured steep V-shaped floors and a remarkably flat sheer along the deck.
And that wasn't an aesthetic choice. The implementation of those V-shaped floors was a direct response to the specific challenges of deep-water surveying and extended isolation.
How so? Like, what does a V shape do that a U shape doesn't?
Well, by altering the traditional rounded hull to a sharper V shape, the surveyors drastically maximized the internal volume of the lower hold. Think about it when a vessel is dispatched to the Australian or Pacific stations in the 1820s. That crew might go upwards of a year without ever seeing a friendly port equipped for naval resupply.
Wow, a year?
Right, so every single square inch of internal space had to be optimized. You needed room for storing water casks, salted provisions, gunpowder, miles of spare canvas, you name it.
And it also helped with navigating the shallows, right?
Absolutely. That specific hull configuration, combined with a relatively manageable draft, made the Atholl class highly capable of coastal surveying in uncharted, shallow littoral zones, places where a larger, heavier frigate would just easily run aground.
But, and this is crucial, despite being a surveying vessel, her armament profile in these naval records proves she was still fully expected to project lethal force if she needed to.
She had teeth.
Big teeth. She carried a total of 28 guns. The upper deck was lined with 20 32-pounder carronades, the quarterdeck mounted 6 18-pounder carronades, and the forecastle was equipped with 2 9-pounder long guns.
This is a fascinating tactical choice.
Yeah, that overwhelming reliance on carronades over traditional long cannons. Why did they do that for a ship operating so far from home waters?
To understand that, you really have to look at the unique ballistics of the carronade itself. It was essentially a short, relatively light, large-bore cannon. The Royal Navy had thoroughly integrated them into their smaller corvettes by the 1820s because they solved a massive problem, the weight-to-firepower ratio.
Because long guns are just incredibly heavy.
Incredibly heavy, and their violent recoil required a massive amount of deck space to operate safely. You need a huge crew just to manhandle one long gun back into position after it fires. By outfitting a 500-ton vessel like the Success primarily with carronades, the Admiralty allowed her to punch drastically above her weight class.
So they gave up range for raw power.
Exactly. Carronades sacrificed long-range accuracy and penetrating power at a distance, but their close-quarters capability was just devastating. It was literally known as a smasher.
The naval records actually calculate her broadside weight at an astonishing 383 pounds of iron.
That is massive for a ship that size.
I mean, if you put yourself in their shoes, if the Success found herself ambushed by heavily armed pirate proas in the East Indies, or if she was intercepted by some opportunistic privateer, that close-range smashing capability would utterly overwhelm almost any non-naval vessel afloat.
It would rip them apart, and those 2 9-pounder long guns on the forecastle, they were retained purely as chase guns, just providing that necessary reach to fire on a fleeing target's rigging to slow them down, or just to signal over the horizon.
So she was this incredibly versatile global workhorse. Though it's worth pointing out she wasn't heavily fortified for extreme polar conditions like those famous bomb vessels, the Terror and the Erebus.
Right, which Henry Peake also had a hand in designing, actually.
Really? That makes sense. But yeah, the Atholl class wasn't meant to go crush through pack ice in the Arctic. She was built for endurance, adaptability, and projecting force across these vast, unmapped stretches of the globe.
And when you consider the official complement numbers, the human element of this engineering marvel, it becomes incredibly stark.
Yeah, this is the part that gets me. We are talking about 175 men stationed within a 114-foot wooden perimeter.
It's hard to even picture.
Try to imagine the sensory reality of that existence for you as a sailor. The pure claustrophobia of the mess deck, the relentless dampness, the constant scent of tar and bilge water and unwashed bodies.
Not to mention the livestock they kept on board for fresh meat.
Exactly. All of that, coupled with the raw, terrifying power of the open ocean. It paints a picture of profound psychological and physical endurance. Just years of being trapped in a wooden box.
The isolation those crews experienced is just deeply difficult for a modern audience to fully contextualize. You can't send a text, you can't radio for help, you are entirely alone. And that profound isolation brings us directly to the expedition that cemented this specific ship's legacy.
Right, let's get into the 1826 mission.
So in January 1826, the Admiralty commissions Captain James Stirling to command the HMS Success. Stirling was 34 years old, and he was a highly ambitious officer. He possessed a very keen, almost aggressive eye for colonial development.
He wasn't just a sailor, he was a politician at heart.
Oh, absolutely. But the Admiralty's initial mandate for Stirling was strictly logistical. He was ordered to sail to New South Wales via Cape Town, and upon arrival, proceed directly north to provide desperately needed supplies to the struggling, disease-ridden British outposts at Melville and Bathurst Islands in northern Australia.
Right, so his official orders keep him strictly in the north. But Port Jackson, Sydney presents a completely different geopolitical reality when he drops anchor there. The sources we have indicate that upon his arrival in Sydney, Stirling immediately recognizes this massive strategic vulnerability regarding the western flank of the continent.
Because staring him right in the face in Sydney Harbor is the French tricolor flag.
Yeah, that must have been quite a shock.
It was Jules Sébastien César Dumont d'Urville's heavily armed exploration vessel, the Astrolabe, anchored right there. And the French government was making absolutely no secret of the fact that they were actively conducting deep, sustained exploration of the western and southern coasts of what was then still largely referred to as New Holland.
And they were claiming it was just for science, right?
Right. These French missions operated officially under the banner of scientific inquiry and botanical surveying. But the British Admiralty and the colonial governors entirely understood the implicit imperial threat. The entire western half of the Australian continent was essentially a massive blank space on the geopolitical map. It was highly vulnerable to a legitimate French territorial claim.
And Stirling leverages this French presence masterfully. If you read the correspondence records between Stirling and Governor Ralph Darling in New South Wales, it reads like an absolute masterclass in exploiting bureaucratic paranoia.
He really knew which buttons to push.
He basically argues to the governor that if the British do not immediately dispatch a heavily armed Royal Navy vessel to establish a physical footprint on the western coast, specifically targeting this largely mythologized area called the Swan River, the French are going to plant a flag and sever British dominance of the Indian Ocean trade routes.
It was a very compelling argument.
Totally. And Governor Darling, feeling the immense pressure of this imperial competition and honestly acting well outside his standard jurisdictional comfort zone, grants Stirling the green light for what is essentially a rogue exploration mission.
Stirling played the geopolitical anxiety of the era perfectly. Consequently, on January 17, 1827, instead of sailing north to relieve those suffering garrisons at Melville Island like he was ordered to, HMS Success departs Sydney and turns south. He heads straight for the uncharted western coast.
Just totally pivots the mission.
Yep. The ship's log traces their route down to Van Diemen's Land. They anchor at the base of Mount Wellington in Hobart to conduct a necessary refit and gather specialized provisions, and then they make the long, treacherous push across the Great Australian Bight. They finally drop anchor off the coast of Reconnaissance Island on March 5, 1827.
Now, there is a highly revealing detail hidden in the personnel logs during this departure from Sydney that I want to bring up.
The crew numbers.
Yes. The diary of the ship's clerk, who is recorded in various sources as either W.C. Gilbert or Augustus H. Gilbert, notes that as they set sail for the Swan River, the crew complement had swelled in some, quote, inexplicable manner to 160 men and 11 boys.
Which is highly unusual.
Very. Given the standard attrition of a long voyage from England, arriving in Sydney with fewer men than you left with was totally normal. People get sick, people desert. Suddenly staffing up to near maximum capacity just before a surveying mission strongly suggests Stirling was operating with a hidden agenda.
Oh, for sure. The clerk's deliberate use of the word inexplicable in a semi-official diary indicates that Stirling was quietly and perhaps unofficially recruiting local specialists. He was pulling hardened bushmen and extra physical labor from the docks of Sydney.
Because he knew what was coming.
Exactly. Stirling knew intimately that an effective survey of an unknown river system wasn't just a matter of sailing past the estuary and sketching a map. He was preparing for a grueling, overland and upriver amphibious assault on the landscape itself.
Yeah.
And he required a surplus of manpower that wouldn't compromise the core sailing capabilities of the Success while she remained at anchor out in the deep water.
And the reality of that upriver assault becomes apparent almost immediately once they get there. On March 8, 1827, Stirling initiates this multi-boat expedition straight into the mouth of the Swan River. They deployed the ship's first gig and the cutter.
Heavy boats.
Very heavy. They victual them heavily for a fortnight's deployment, making sure the men are fully armed against potential hostilities. And they managed to push roughly 54 kilometers upriver, reaching the general vicinity of present-day Guildford. But the physical mechanics of this journey, it was agonizing.
Agonizing is the right word. The estuarine environment of the Swan River in the late summer was just unforgiving. The river system was choked with dense mudflats, hidden limestone bars, and incredibly shallow sandbanks.
And these boats weren't designed for that.
No. The drafts of the cutter and gig, especially when loaded down with a fortnight's worth of salted provisions, scientific equipment, and heavily armed men, were way too deep to simply float upriver. The expedition logs describe this miserable process where the crew is repeatedly vaulting over the sides of the boats into waist-deep water.
And just dragging them.
Utilizing sheer brute force to drag these massive wooden hulls over the sandbars day after blistering day, under the intense Western Australian sun. You can only imagine the physical toll on those sailors. It was immense.
Yet, when you read the resulting paperwork, it completely belies the suffering of the crew. It sounds like a lovely holiday.
The PR spin begins.
Right, because Stirling had the foresight to bring along Charles Fraser, the official colonial botanist of New South Wales, alongside Frederick Garling, who was an accomplished landscape artist. And the reports they compiled upon returning to the Success were almost suspiciously glowing.
Suspicious is putting it mildly.
Fraser documented that the soil along the riverbanks was, quote, superior to any he had seen in New South Wales. Meanwhile, Garling produced this series of stunning watercolors depicting lush, verdant, almost European-style parklands.
And we really have to analyze Fraser's botanical assessment with a highly critical eye here, because his conclusions were historically disastrous.
Why was he so wrong?
Well, Fraser evaluated the sandy, nutrient-poor coastal soils of the Swan River coastal plain entirely through the lens of traditional temperate British agriculture. He was looking at native Australian vegetation and assuming the soil beneath it would support wheat and sheep just like back in Surrey. His assessment was wildly inaccurate and structurally flawed from a scientific standpoint.
But Stirling didn't care about the science, did he?
Not at all. Stirling was not acting as an impartial scientist. He was acting as a venture capitalist. He required a compelling marketing narrative to convince a highly skeptical British government to underwrite the immense financial risk of establishing a completely new colony. The objective truth regarding the agricultural viability of the soil was totally secondary to the persuasive power of the report.
And Stirling weaponizes Fraser's incompetence brilliantly. He takes this glowing, scientifically flawed botanical report, pairs it with Garling's highly romanticized landscape paintings, and returns to London to aggressively lobby the Foreign Office and the Admiralty.
He had a whole pitch ready.
He proposes a radical departure from the penal colony model of New South Wales. Stirling pitches a purely capitalist, free settler colony, one that would require zero government funding and entirely reject the use of convict labor. And the hook for private investors was incredibly lucrative. He offered land grants of 40 acres for every £3 worth of capital or goods a settler brought to the colony.
And the sociological appeal of this pitch to the British public cannot be overstated. There was this massive demographic of middle-class citizens back in England who were eager for land ownership, but they were utterly desperate to avoid the deeply ingrained social stigma, what they called the convict stain, associated with migrating to New South Wales or Van Diemen's Land.
They wanted a clean slate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Stirling offered them a pristine, socially respectable utopia. Honestly, had Charles Fraser possessed the necessary expertise to accurately report the profound agricultural limitations of that sandy soil, the British government would have almost certainly dismissed the proposal entirely. The very existence of modern-day Perth is largely predicated on the momentum generated by that deeply flawed botanical survey.
It's amazing how history hinges on a bad soil sample.
Truly.
So the lobbying effort is entirely successful. By June 1829, Stirling returns in absolute triumph. He's now the newly minted lieutenant governor, arriving aboard the transport ship Parmelia, officially founding the Swan River colony.
But starting a colony isn't just about showing up with tents.
No, a nascent colony situated at the absolute edge of the world requires immediate naval protection and logistical support. Consequently, the Admiralty dispatches our ship, the HMS Success, back to Western Australia. She arrives on November 28, 1829, now under the command of Captain William Jervoise. But almost immediately upon her arrival, the colony's fragile existence is thrown into absolute chaos.
Right, because the hydrographic reality of the water surrounding the Swan River, specifically the area known as Cockburn Sound, was incredibly treacherous. The region was poorly charted, plagued by violently shifting sandbanks, unpredictable tidal currents, and these submerged limestone reefs that could literally get a haul in seconds.
And on December 3rd, 1829, though, to be fair, some archival accounts place the event in late November. The HMS Success was attempting to maneuver through these highly dangerous waters. Due to a critical failure in pilotage, the 500-ton warship slams violently into a submerged geological hazard known as shagrock on Carnac Reef.
And this wasn't just a gentle bump. The damage reports filed in the Naval Archives detail an almost fatal structural trauma. The main keel, which serves as the foundational backbone of the entire vessel, was shivered.
Meaning it was deeply splintered and structurally compromised.
Shivered from the forefoot all the way back to the mainmast. The false keel, which is the sacrificial timber bolted beneath the main keel to protect it during groundings, was violently stripped away entirely. The stem was shattered by the sheer impact, and the thick oak planking on the larboard side was ground against the reef until it was rubbed almost entirely through.
And to fully grasp the sheer panic this event induced, we have to zoom out and examine the colony's logistics ledger at that exact moment. You have to understand how bad things already were on shore.
It was already a disaster.
The reality of Fraser's flawed soil report had violently manifested. The settlers' traditional crops were failing in the sand, and the population was teetering on the absolute brink of starvation. Compounding this, roughly 25 immigrant ships had arrived in the span of 6 months, disgorging hundreds of completely unprepared settlers onto the beaches and creating total logistical paralysis.
They had no infrastructure.
None. The colony possessed 0 defensive fortifications. The HMS Success was not merely a visiting warship, it was their floating fortress. It was their primary means of enforcing order and their only reliable tether to the outside world. Snapping her keel on shagrock effectively severed that tether.
And the structural relationship between a main keel and a vessel of that tonnage meant that, without access to a dry dock, repairing that damage was considered virtually impossible in 1829. I mean, the nearest naval refit facilities were thousands of miles away in Trincomalee, India, or all the way back in Portsmouth. A ship suffering a shattered backbone in the unforgiving waters of the Indian Ocean was, by all established maritime logic, a total and complete write-off.
The atmospheric tension on the shore must have been absolutely suffocating. Imagine you are a settler. You watch as the Success remains stranded on the reef for days, utterly helpless, her hull subjected to the relentless, punishing rhythm of the heavy Indian Ocean swell. The colony's survival strategy suddenly hinged entirely on the survival of this critically wounded vessel.
But the Royal Navy crews refused to surrender the ship. Through an immense display of seamanship, they eventually managed to refloat the badly leaking hull. They utilized continuous exhausting pumping and towed her into a highly sheltered cove on Garden Island, a location they appropriately named Careening Bay.
Which sets the stage for one of the most remarkable feats of 19th century maritime engineering. Because they could not physically remove the ship from the water to access the shattered keel, they had to bring the keel out of the water.
By violently rotating the entire 500-ton vessel onto its side.
Which is a process known in naval architecture as heaving down, or careening. And the physics involved in heaving down a vessel of the Atholl class without the infrastructure of a naval dockyard are staggering. Think about trying to flip a building over in the water using just ropes.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
They pressed the smaller sloop, HMS Cruiser, into service, mooring her securely to act as a massive floating anchor point. The shipwrights and crew rigged this incredibly complex, high-tension network of massive blocks, tackles, and multifold purchases. These lines were fixed between the masts of the Success, the hull of the cruiser, and heavy capstans that were deeply entrenched into the sandy shores of Garden Island.
And then they just started pulling.
Utilizing hundreds of men manning those capstans, they applied sheer mechanical advantage to physically force the warship over onto her beam ends, exposing the ruined keel to the open air.
And the inherent danger of this operation is documented in the failure of their very first attempt. The archives note that in January 1830, during the initial effort to heave her down, the immense localized stress placed on the rigging caused the heavy tackle to violently snap.
Which is terrifying.
The sheer kinetic energy released by parting lines under that much load was lethal. It highlights the absolute desperation of the crew that they didn't give up. They immediately re-rigged the system, attempted it again, and ultimately succeeded. But once the keel was exposed, they faced an entirely new logistical nightmare.
Right, because they had completely exhausted their supply of English oak.
And this is the precise moment where absolute necessity forces revolutionary innovation. Lacking the traditional European hardwoods required to construct a new keel, the shipwrights were forced to experiment with a highly abundant, completely unknown local timber that the desperate settlers had begun calling Swan River mahogany.
Which today we recognize by its indigenous Noongar name, Jarrah, or scientifically as Eucalyptus marginata.
And the integration of Jarrah into the structural repair of a Royal Navy warship turned out to be an absolute revelation for maritime engineering, didn't it?
Oh, totally. The shipwrights quickly discovered that Jarrah possessed physical properties that far exceeded their expectations. It was incredibly dense, so heavy that it barely possessed any natural buoyancy at all, and its structural strength far surpassed that of traditional European oak.
But the real superpower was its resistance to marine life.
Exactly. More crucially, for the longevity of a wooden hull, the dense interlocking grain and natural oils of the Jarrah made it highly resistant to the teredo worm. Now, the teredo worm is this voracious marine borer that notoriously devastated wooden ships operating in warm tropical waters. It basically eats the ship from the outside in, but the Jarrah repelled it. Utilizing this newly discovered timber, the crew successfully fashioned and fitted a brand new main keel, a false keel, and a forefoot.
But shaping that dense timber without a sawmill, just using hand tools, the physical toll kept the crew laboring in Careening Bay from February straight through to May of 1830. Finally, the hull is deemed seaworthy. By 1831, HMS Success departs Western Australia and embarks on the grueling multi-ocean voyage back to Portsmouth, England.
And you have to picture the reception they expected back home. The Admiralty surveyors, having received the initial dispatches regarding the catastrophic damage sustained on Carnac Reef, fully anticipated that the structural integrity of the hull would be compromised beyond repair.
Right.
They expected to send her straight to the breaker's yard.
But when they finally maneuvered her into a dry dock in Portsmouth and inspected those makeshift Australian repairs, the assessment completely shocked them.
The official structural reports filed in Portsmouth tell a fascinating story. The surveyors declared the Jarrah repairs to be in, quote, perfect condition. Despite spending a year submerged in highly active marine environments and enduring a voyage halfway across the globe, the Swan River timber exhibited zero signs of rot, zero structural fatigue at the joints, and absolutely no evidence of borer damage.
It was indestructible.
The Admiralty was so overwhelmingly impressed by the mechanical and biological resilience of this undocumented hardwood that they immediately authorized an order for 200 loads of Jarrah timber from the Swan River colony.
And that single Admiralty order fundamentally altered the economic trajectory of Western Australia. Think about it, the colony had been functionally starving, paralyzed by the agricultural failure of the sandy soil, utterly desperate for a viable economic export just to survive. Because a navigational error drove a warship into a submerged rock, the British accidentally discovered the region's greatest natural resource.
The subsequent timber export industry provided the vital economic bedrock that allowed the colony to endure its disastrous early years.
It is a profound historical irony. HMS Success did not merely map the location of the colony. Her near destruction inadvertently catalyzed the very industry that kept the settlers alive. And because her Jarrah repairs proved so incredibly durable, the Admiralty granted the Success a reprieve from the scrap heap.
She got a second life.
She did. She transitioned into a role as a receiving ship, which is essentially a heavily utilized floating harbor barracks in Portsmouth. She served in that unglamorous but vital capacity for another 16 years until she was finally and quietly dismantled in 1849, marking a noble end to a profoundly impactful naval career.
And the quiet dismantling in 1849 should be the definitive end of the narrative. But this is precisely where the historical record takes a violent detour into the realm of the absurd. The genuine legacy of the 1825 HMS Success gets systematically hijacked by an unprecedented act of historical fabrication.
Right, we have to talk about what is now known as the Great Convict Ship Fraud.
To understand the mechanics of this hoax, we have to shift our focus entirely away from naval architecture and look at the sociology of late 19th century sensationalism. We must introduce a completely different vessel, also named Success.
A totally different ship.
Yes. This was not a British corvette, but rather a 621-ton merchant vessel constructed entirely from teak in a shipyard in Burma in 1840. That's a full 15 years after Stirling's ship was launched.
So the fundamental facts are entirely divergent. We are looking at a completely different ship, built in a different hemisphere, utilizing different timber, and designed for commercial freight rather than naval serving.
Exactly. But the 1840 teak Success possessed a highly eventful, genuinely dark history of its own. She initially operated on the immigrant runs, transporting settlers from England to the expanding Australian colonies. Her operational life fractured in 1852 when she arrived in Melbourne at the absolute zenith of the Victorian gold rush.
And everyone knows what happened to ships in Melbourne during the gold rush.
The allure of the goldfields was so overwhelming that her entire crew, from the able seamen all the way up to the officers, deserted the vessel. They just vanished into the goldfields, leaving her permanently stranded at anchor. The Victorian government, struggling with a massive surge in crime and hopelessly overcrowded penal infrastructure due to the gold rush population boom, purchased the abandoned hull and converted it into a highly secure, floating prison hulk moored in Hobson's Bay.
And the conditions aboard that prison hulk were notoriously brutal. The historical records confirm this is the exact vessel where the highly controversial and brutal superintendent of convicts, John Giles Price, was ultimately murdered by a mob of enraged prisoners in 1857.
So the ship undeniably possessed a deeply grim, authentic history of human suffering.
But a genuine history of Victorian penal brutality apparently wasn't sensational enough for the syndicate that acquired the vessel decades later.
Not even close. By 1890, the era of British convict transportation had definitively ended. But the Victorian public had cultivated this deeply morbid, highly lucrative fascination with the macabre details of the penal era. A syndicate of entrepreneurial showmen approaches the aging, obsolete prison hulk with the explicit intention of transforming it into a floating museum of horrors.
A haunted house on water.
Basically. However, to maximize their ticketing revenue, they determined that a Victorian-era prison hulk wasn't ancient or terrifying enough. They needed a darker mythology. So they engaged in a calculated rewriting of the public record.
When you look at the promotional flyers and broadsides printed by the syndicate in the 1890s, the sheer audacity of their marketing strategy is staggering. They aggressively marketed the teak merchant vessel as the, quote, oldest ship afloat. They blatantly falsified her construction records, claiming she was built in 1787 or 1790, just to align her with the arrival of the first fleet.
Which is just a massive lie.
Well, and most destructively, they deliberately and methodically merged her identity with Captain Stirling's 1825 HMS Success. They explicitly instructed their tour guides to inform paying customers that this Burmese teak merchantman was the very same Royal Navy warship that had explored the Swan River and founded Western Australia.
And the theatricality they employed to sell this lie was relentless. They gutted the hold and installed rows of horrifying, highly exaggerated wax figures depicting convicts in various stages of agony.
Like a Madame Tussauds of torture.
Exactly. They contracted blacksmiths to forge fake medieval-style torture devices. We're talking iron maidens, heavy-leaded whips, spiked restraint chairs, things that were absolutely never utilized in 19th century British penal systems, let alone on that specific ship.
It's just total fiction.
Total fiction. And to lend an air of authentic criminal danger to the exhibition, they even briefly employed Harry Power, a notorious aging former bushranger who famously mentored the outlaw Ned Kelly, to act as a tour guide and regale the crowds with largely fabricated tales of terror.
But the drama surrounding this fraudulent vessel frequently bled into reality. While the ship was being exhibited in Sydney Harbor, unknown individuals actually maliciously scuttled her, sinking the hull into the mud of Careening Bay.
Probably someone offended by the lies.
Probably. But rather than abandoning the enterprise, the syndicate brilliantly weaponized the sinking as a massive publicity stunt. They raised the foul-smelling hull from the harbor floor, pumped out the sludge, and decided to expand their market globally.
They took the show on the road.
They sailed this floating haunted house across the ocean to England, Ireland, and eventually across the Atlantic to the United States. They heavily targeted the American market, aggressively billing her as an ancient, barbaric British torture ship. They even audaciously claimed she predated the revered USS Constitution.
And the most alarming aspect of this hoax is how thoroughly it penetrated and corrupted the actual institutional historical record. This was not merely a transparent carnival trick that the educated public immediately dismissed. The syndicate's aggressive marketing successfully overwrote the factual history of the 1825 corvette for decades.
It's terrifying how well it worked.
Even official government archivists were deceived. If you examine the Western Australian Yearbook, published between 1902 and 1904, you will find officially sanctioned photographs of the 1840 prison hulk, prominently featuring its gruesome wax figures and fabricated torture cells, definitively labeled as Captain Stirling's historic HMS Success. The sheer volume of the sensationalized lie completely eclipsed the quiet, technical reality of the true vessel.
It reveals a deeply ingrained psychological preference within the public consciousness. I mean, the masses, whether they were in Sydney, London, or Ohio, they didn't want to pay admission to hear a nuanced, complex narrative about hydrographic surveys, the challenges of navigating estuarine sandbars, or the specific cellular density of Jarrah timber.
No. They crave the visceral thrill of blood, guts, and a gruesome ghost ship.
It acts as a powerful historical precedent demonstrating how easily fabricated sensationalism can overwrite factual reality long before the advent of digital misinformation.
But the ultimate fate of the fake success is suitably undignified and highly ironic. After spending decades touring the ports of the American Great Lakes as a decaying, increasingly dilapidated sideshow attraction, her profitability plummeted.
The public finally got bored.
They did. And on July 4th, 1946, while berthed in the shallow, muddy waters of Lake Erie near Port Clinton, Ohio, the vessel caught fire. The blaze is almost universally attributed to local vandals. The fire rapidly consumed the old teak timbers, burning the ship right down to the waterline, permanently incinerating the fake torture devices, the melting wax figures, and the fabricated history along with it.
The contrast between the ultimate fates of the two vessels is incredibly stark. The loud, fraudulent, huckster-driven Success burns to ash as a forgotten carnival act in an American lake. Meanwhile, the genuine 1825 HMS Success, the heavily armed donkey frigate that mapped the hostile coast, survived the shattering impact on Carnac Reef and unlocked the economic salvation of an entire colony, was quietly and methodically dismantled by shipwrights in a naval yard in Portsmouth in 1849, having completed a proud, deeply consequential career.
And while the physical timbers of the 1825 corvette were broken down and repurposed in England, her true legacy was never lost. It was simply transferred into the physical geography of Western Australia. If you examine a modern map of the Perth metropolitan area, the nomenclature directly tied to her voyage is omnipresent.
The geographic encoding of her story is undeniable. In 1973, recognizing the foundational importance of the vessel, the city of Cockburn officially designated a major, rapidly developing suburb as Success. Furthermore, Success Hill in the suburb of Bassendean physically marks the approximate inland limit that Stirling's exhausted crew reached while hauling those heavy boats up the Swan River back in 1827.
And navigational charts still prominently feature Success Bank in Cockburn Sound. It's a permanent warning of the shallow sands that plagued her navigation. And of course, Careening Bay remains a defined location on Garden Island, forever marking the site of that miraculous, desperate Jarrah repair.
Beyond the cartography, the Western Australian Maritime Museum has conducted extensive, highly detailed archaeological excavations that further ground this narrative in physical reality. On the shores of Garden Island, maritime archaeologists have identified and surveyed port-related structural remnants that highly likely correspond to the massive, deeply entrenched capstans and anchor pits utilized by the crew during that terrifying heaving-down operation in 1830.
And the underwater archaeology is equally compelling. Out on the seabed near Shag Rock off Carnac Island, dive teams have successfully recovered heavy copper fastening bolts and sections of protective copper sheathing. Metallurgical analysis confirms these artifacts were violently ripped from the hull of the Success during the catastrophic grounding in 1829.
It's amazing that pieces of her are still there.
These tangible items bridge the centuries. The ship's oak may have been dismantled in Portsmouth, but her DNA, her shattered copper bolts, the heavy anchors of her rigging systems, the literal sweat of her crew embedded in the soil of Garden Island. It remains physically scattered across the coastline of Western Australia.
The recovery of those artifacts provides a definitive counter-narrative to the 1890s hoax. It proves that while a syndicate of carnival barkers can steal a name and fabricate a dark mythology for a few highly profitable decades, the genuine physical history and the deep geographic impact of a vessel are much harder to permanently erase. The 1825 HMS Success was the mechanical and logistical catalyst that transformed an abstract line on an admiralty map into a thriving modern state.
Taking a moment to survey the full arc of this narrative, the journey is almost difficult to comprehend. We began with the construction of a rugged, heavily armed donkey frigate, designed purely for efficiency and endurance. We tracked her unauthorized deployment to the Swan River, driven by French imperial paranoia.
We witnessed her near destruction on a hidden reef, and her resurrection through the sheer, desperate engineering of her crew and the accidental discovery of a revolutionary timber.
And we saw how her true identity was forced to battle against the overwhelming historical shadow of a completely fabricated, wax figure-filled sideshow attraction.
The entire saga operates as a profound historical study concerning the mechanics of exploration, the cascading consequences of naval disasters, the unexpected engines of colonial innovation, and the deeply strange, highly malleable nature of public memory.
It really is a testament to what endures and what fades away.
It is. I want to leave you with this final thought to mull over. The fake 1840 Success spent decades sailing the globe, desperately trying to convince the world of a dark, fictional history that never actually belonged to its timbers. It sought immortality through horrors that never occurred on its decks. Meanwhile, the real 1825 HMS Success was quietly broken down into scrap in 1849, yet its true legacy never vanished. Instead, the reality of its triumphs was quietly absorbed into the very maps, the sprawling suburbs, and the vast foundational timber industries of Western Australia. It makes you wonder how many other places on our modern maps are named after quiet, forgotten technical triumphs, while the loud, sensational lies end up dominating the history books.
That is a fascinating question to consider.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the true legacy of HMS Success. If you want to visualize the landscape exactly as Captain Stirling saw it before the colony was built, I highly encourage you to search online for Frederick Garling's original 1827 watercolor paintings of the Swan River. Until next time, keep exploring.